August 1945. After thousands of bombings, millions of shots fired, and countless hand-to-hand combats, silence falls. The unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany is a cause for celebration in every corner of Europe. However, the roar of war is still heard loudly in the Pacific. There, the United States and Japan have fought to the death for the past few years, but a new contender has just burst in with a brutal offensive. This is Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, which sent more than 1.5 million men to face the Imperial Army in Manchuria, the occupied lands in the northwest of China. The battle turns into a true massacre that dyes the plains and mountains alike red. While in Tokyo, they try to deal with the atomic bombs that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, another piece of news shocks the emperor. 100,000 of his soldiers have been annihilated by the USSR. In this new military history video, we will learn everything about the savage war unleashed by the Soviets on the Asian front. The brutality experienced in just a few days can only be compared to the violence the Nazis experienced in Stalingrad. Now, it is the Japanese who must decide between surrendering or dying in the face of a devastating enemy. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union officially declared war on Japan by sending 1,600,000 soldiers into the occupied territory of Manchuria in northeastern China. The forces were under the command of Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky. Their objective, to advance towards the rest of the country, Korea, and also the Kuril Islands, forcing the enemy to retreat quickly. However, the USSR was aware that it was facing a powerful army made up of 1 million men from the empire. That invasion meant the fulfillment of the promise made by Stalin to the British and American leaders. He had assured that he would join the battle against the Japanese after the defeat of Nazi Germany, regardless of the non-aggression agreement he had with Tokyo since 1941. In fact, the Asian country expected the Soviets to mediate to achieve peace with the Allied forces, but that would never happen. In this way, in the midst of a historic milestone such as the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a brutal offensive was launched to definitively crush the resistance of the Japanese Empire. The fighting against the United States had been going on for several years. Both countries lost an innumerable number of men in the conflict. However, the American country changed the logic of war conflicts forever with the invention of the nuclear bomb. This deadly weapon was used for the first time on August 6, 1945 in the city of Hiroshima, razing an entire city in a matter of seconds. Still unable to process the trauma of the deaths, 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. Radiation invaded the Asian country, but it did not arrive alone. A storm was brewing on another front. The remote lands of Manchuria were preparing for an unprecedented massacre. A confrontation so fierce that despite not having the destructive power of the bombs, it would cause an equally catastrophic number of deaths. It was a lightning offensive that unleashed relentless fighting in Northwest Asia, marking the last major ground battle of World War II. The Red Army, hardened in the bloodiest battles on the European front, was determined to finish off the proud and feared Kwantung troops as quickly as possible. A spectacle of fire and death was about to begin.
No fewer than 136,000 railway wagons were used as victorious Soviet forces from the west journeyed up to 12,000 kilometers to take up positions in the east. By early August, 1.6 million men were ready to take part in the Manchuria attack.
As we have already mentioned, The operation began on August 9, 1945, but preparations had begun several weeks earlier. There was a deceptive calm that preceded the furious battle. The silence of the Siberian steppes was only interrupted by the sound of Soviet trains transporting soldiers, tanks, and ammunition towards the border with Manchuria. The Red Army was preparing for an attack that would seek to end the war. The order came directly from Moscow. Stalin, with his sights set on consolidating the USSR's influence in East Asia, knew that the destruction of the Kwantung Army was the key to forcing the Japanese surrender. The Soviet military deployment was massive. It mobilized more than 1.5 million men, who would also be backed by thousands of tanks, planes, and heavy artillery. Grouped into 3 main fronts, they would use all the experience acquired in the recent confrontation against the Nazis. Those years of relentless fighting had turned them into an efficient, ruthless, and lethal force. The tension was palpable. Soldiers hardened by the horrors of Stalingrad knew what was coming. Many had lost friends, family, and comrades on the European front. Now they prepared for the final battle. But this time, the enemy was different. One who was desperately fighting to protect the remaining possessions of their crumbling empire. The Kwantung Army, once the jewel of Asian power, was now a shadow of its former self. Its best men and resources had been diverted to the defense of Japan's main islands. Those who remained were poorly trained soldiers, poorly armed, and without the proper equipment to face the destructive power that was approaching. But still, honor and tradition compelled them to resist. Therefore, the Soviets debated different ways of how to advance on the enemy before making the final decision.
There was some thought given to the idea of a staggered attack, to advance from the west before engaging the troops on the other side of the country. But in the end, it was those who argued for a simultaneous attack whose opinion prevailed. So the Trans-Baikal Front, the Second Far Eastern Front, and the First Far Eastern Front all attacked together.
From the north, east, and west, Red Army troops began their offensive, advancing with a precision that only war veterans could achieve. The sheer number of troops posed a challenge for coordination, but the Soviet war machine was perfectly oiled. The darkness of the night became the great ally of the enormous force, invisible to the eyes of the enemy despite its size. Soon, Japan's fighters were in for a huge and unwanted surprise.
At first, the Japanese failed to notice the almost silent companies of infantry and supporting engineers. When the advancing Soviets arrived at the first of the Japanese defensive positions, they were still well protected by the cover of night, and the full reality of the situation now revealed itself to the Japanese forces.
The silence was broken by the deafening roar of Soviet artillery. T-34 tanks crushed Japanese defenses like paper, while waves of infantry followed suit, advancing deep into Manchuria. The skies darkened with smoke from the bombing raids. Stalin's planes dropped huge amounts of explosives on Japanese positions, reducing their rivals' fortifications and command centers to rubble. The soldiers in Tokyo had never seen an offensive of such magnitude. Despite the efforts of the Kwantung Army, they were quickly outnumbered. They were caught in a whirlwind of destruction. Casualties piled up with each passing hour. Japanese lines collapsed under the overwhelming force of the Soviets. The sound of explosions, the screams of the wounded, and the incessant machine gun fire created the perfect symphony of horror. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the intensity of the attack. In a desperate attempt to halt the enemy advance, Imperial troops launched suicidal counterattacks. Small infantry units armed only with bayonets and grenades rushed towards the Soviet tanks with blind determination. However, the enemy's armored vehicles advanced mercilessly, crushing any resistance with tons of steel. Within days, the Red Army had crossed dozens of kilometers of enemy territory, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake.
It was the 11th of August before the Japanese were able to regroup in any sort of order, by which time 5th Army had advanced 80 kilometers into Manchurian territory. The Japanese had been taken completely by surprise, and the Soviet 5th Army had exceeded their own expectations. By the 11th of August, advance troops were heading towards the vital city of Mutanqiang, headquarters of the Japanese 1st Area Army. The plan was to take the city within 18 days.
As the Soviets moved closer to the mountains and deserts of Manchuria, the situation became even more desperate. Japanese units, unable to organize a coherent defense, tried to take refuge on higher ground, hoping that the difficult geographical conditions would slow the enemy advance. Unfortunately for them, this was not to be the case. The USSR forces continued to march forward with the same relentless brutality, no matter what surface they found themselves on. Airstrikes continued to punish the enemy, while infantry troops traversed narrow and treacherous paths, ambushing Japanese men trapped in unfavorable terrain. The fighting in the mountains was fierce and intense. Soviet patrols surprised enemies in the valleys, and hand-to-hand fighting with knives, bayonets, and grenades was common. Battle cries and the whistling of bullets never stopped. For many Japanese soldiers, there was no escape. Those who did not fall in the fighting perished on the steep slopes or were lost in the deserts. Casualties multiplied on both sides, but the Asian forces, exhausted and poorly equipped, suffered the most. The number of dead and wounded was immeasurable. In the end, the mountains and deserts of Manchuria that seemed to represent the Japanese salvation became vast improvised cemeteries where the bodies of thousands of fallen soldiers were abandoned. The Soviet offensive was a true unstoppable storm that knew no mercy, and for the Japanese, there was no more refuge.
All over eastern Manchuria, the Japanese were stunned by the Soviet assault. Earlier in 1945, the Kwantung Army leadership had accepted the need for a defensive strategy in the event of a Soviet attack. The plan was to engage the invaders immediately, before staging an orderly withdrawal to the plains region in the south, while continuing to harry the enemy at every opportunity. The hope was that the Soviet troops would then be tired and vulnerable to a counterattack.
It was a realistic strategy from the Japanese Empire's point of view, but reality proved that the speed of the Soviet assault prevented any kind of response. Moreover, the attack was not only lethal on the ground. After the first days of the offensive, the skies of Manchuria had become a battlefield of their own. The Red Army's fighters and bombers dominated the air, taking the war to a new dimension. From the first light of dawn, the wings of the planes crossed the horizon, leaving behind them trails of smoke and devastation. The Soviet pilots, veterans of the violent aerial combats over Europe, now displayed their experience against an outnumbered and disorganized enemy. Tokyo's aircraft, which knew how to dominate Asia, were now scarce and poorly maintained. Within a few days, the Imperial forces in Manchuria practically ceased to exist. Their planes were torn apart in the air or destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. Meanwhile, USSR bombers continued to drop their deadly load on enemy positions, reducing defensive structures and supply centers to rubble. Columns of Japanese tanks and troops tried to reorganize quickly. However, they became easy targets for Stalin's aircraft, which attacked them mercilessly with explosives or machine guns from above. Chaos was absolute. Japanese soldiers ran desperately seeking shelter in improvised trenches, only to be hit by artillery fire. Those who managed to survive the bombing were almost immediately confronted by the advanced Soviet forces, which arrived like a whirlwind, destroying what was left of the rival defenses. On the ground, the Red Army's tanks were unstoppable. Rows of armored vehicles moved across the vast plains of Manchuria, destroying any resistance. Without any kind of inventiveness or innovative tactics, the Japanese continued to bet on suicide missions by driving vehicles packed with explosives towards their adversaries. The Kwantung Army, the Japanese pride, was on the brink of total annihilation. Once praised as the empire's most powerful in Asia, the command had underestimated the Soviet ability to launch such a swift and devastating offensive. Within days, the renowned troops had been decimated. The Red Army's advance had not only been rapid, but also brutally efficient. Stalin's forces smashed through Japanese defenses and captured key cities with equal ease. Ports and communication routes were at their mercy with astonishing speed. The Soviet plan was clear: not to let the Japanese forces have a moment's respite, and to crush any attempt at reorganization before it could even begin. In many cases, Japanese troops were unable to cope with the overwhelming power of their enemy. Entire units of the Kwantung Army surrendered without even firing a shot. Their officers were aware of the futility of continuing the fight.
Soviet attackers were now full of the confidence generated by the speed of their advance. The original invasion plan anticipated the capture of Mutanchiang by the 18th day of hostilities. But as early as day 3, General Krylov was able to dispatch an advance party of 5th Army to test the Japanese defenses at Mutanchiang. The result was clear. The Japanese forces were engaged in a continuing withdrawal in the face of Soviet armor and especially artillery.
Other Japanese commanders, blinded by honor and the defense of their homeland, chose to fight on, giving themselves over to almost certain death. The massacres that followed were devastating. Japanese casualties continued to mount by the day. The Kwantung Army was destroyed in the field, and its officers were captured. The Soviets took hundreds of thousands of prisoners, many of whom were sent to labor camps in Siberia. For Japan, the loss of this unit marked the end of its dominance in continental Asia and ended hopes of meaningful resistance. That emblem of power, the once feared and respected troop, was reduced to ashes.
The sheer speed of the invasion had taken them by surprise. In the face of an army marching forward at 100 kilometers per day, the defending forces had little choice but to withdraw into fortified positions, to be taken out at the leisure of the Soviet commanders. A well-organized retreat was impossible under the circumstances, and by the 14th of August, after just 5 days of fighting, the Japanese leadership knew that the battle for Manchuria was effectively over.
On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. For many soldiers in Manchuria, the news came too late. The destruction of their lands was irreversible, and the suffering continued. The battlefields were littered with corpses and devastated vehicles. They were a grim reminder of the ferocity of the operation. Despite everything, Soviet soldiers continued to advance like a bulldozer without brakes, capturing stragglers and eliminating the last pockets of resistance. For Japanese civilians living in the occupied regions, the arrival of Stalin's troops represented only one thing: terror. Many fled or committed suicide in the face of the approaching invasion. For them, the atrocities committed during the capture of cities by the Red Army were worse than death. On the other side of the fence, in the USSR, the enormous success of the operation that had been launched just a few weeks earlier was celebrated. Not only had the famed Kwantung Army been defeated, but it had also managed to secure key territories and force Japan to accept unconditional surrender. True, the price had been high. Soviet forces suffered around 12,000 casualties in their ranks. But that number seems very small compared to the nearly 100,000 deaths that Japanese troops had to endure. The attack had been truly devastating. As if that were not enough, the operation also changed the geopolitical map of Asia, marking the end of Japan's imperial era. The lost territories included Manchuria, North Korea, the Sakhalin and Kuril Islands. Every inch occupied by Stalin's men would never again be controlled by Tokyo. A new history began for the region, albeit with deep and permanent scars for a population that lived through the bloody battle up close. A reign of blood that culminated on September 2, 1945, when the Japanese formally signed their surrender. Thus, the worst conflict the world has ever known came to an end. Now, after having experienced the last and fiercest battle of World War II, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having joined us. We look forward to seeing you in the next military history video.